Hello and welcome back to our journey into the wizarding world's untold paths. Tonight we step into a story that begins exactly as the one you know, the same train whistle echoing across platform 9 3/4, the same nervous first years clutching their wands, the same ancient castle, rising from the Scottish Highlands like a beacon of impossible dreams made manifest. The familiar scents of parchment and dragonhide trunks fill the air as September's golden light filters through the Great Hall's enchanted ceiling. You know this moment. The Sorting Hat's ancient song, the nervous shuffling of robes, the way hope and terror dance together in every 11-year-old heart. The 4 house tables stretch before new students like pathways to destiny, each representing a different way of belonging in a world that has always existed just beyond the reach of ordinary children. But in this tale, where candlelight flickers with the same warm promise and the castle walls hold the same eternal secrets, a single moment of panic will unravel everything we thought we knew about the boy who lived. One flash of uncontrolled magic, one terrified heartbeat, one choice made in darkness will send ripples through time itself, transforming hero into exile and destiny into something altogether more dangerous. Tonight we discover what happens when belonging becomes a privilege that can be stripped away, when fame offers no protection against fear, and when the wizarding world's greatest hope becomes its most unwelcome threat. The Great Hall buzzed with its usual September energy as first years awaited the Sorting Hat's ancient wisdom, their faces illuminated by thousands of floating candles that cast dancing shadows across stone walls. Older than memory, the enchanted ceiling reflected a perfect starlit sky, as if the universe itself had gathered to witness these crucial moments when children discovered where they truly belonged. Harry Potter, small and uncertain beneath his oversized robes, felt the weight of 1,000 stairs pressing against his lightning bolt scar. Like a physical force, whispers followed him wherever he walked. That's Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the one who defeated you-know-who, each word carrying expectations he couldn't possibly understand. His hands trembled as he clutched his wand, the Hollywood warm against his palm, a tangible connection to a world that still felt like an impossible dream. The Sorting Hat settled on his unruly black hair with ceremonial gravity, its patches and folds holding centuries of secrets. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Harry heard nothing but his own thundering heartbeat. Then the hat's voice whispered inside his mind, speaking of courage and ambition, of the hunger for knowledge and the loyalty that ran deeper than blood. When it finally shouted Gryffindor across the hall, the scarlet and gold table erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. For one brief shining moment, Harry Potter belonged somewhere. But belonging, as he would soon learn, was far more fragile than fame. 3 weeks into term, when the novelty of magic had settled into routine, and Harry had begun to believe that Hogwarts might truly be his home, curiosity led him through forbidden corridors. After midnight, the castle wore a different face in darkness. Shadows stretched longer, portraits dozed in their frames, and even the moving staircases seemed to tread more carefully, as if afraid to wake sleeping secrets. The 3rd floor corridor, strictly off-limits according to Dumbledore's stern warning at the start of term feast, called to Harry with the same magnetic pull that had always drawn him toward trouble. Perhaps it was the way other students lowered their voices when they passed its entrance, or the fact that even Fred and George Weasley spoke of it, only in whispers. Whatever the reason, Harry found himself standing before a locked door that seemed to pulse with hidden power. The lock yielded to a simple Alohomora, a spell Hermione had taught him just days earlier, and Harry stepped into darkness so complete it seemed solid. Behind the locked door, Fluffy's 3 massive heads snarled in the shadows, each the size of a small dragon, guarding secrets Harry wasn't meant to discover for months yet. Yellow eyes glowed like lanterns in the black, and the creature's breath came in rumbling growls that vibrated through the stone floor. But when Fluffy lunged with terrible purpose, all 3 heads snapping toward the small intruder who had dared to disturb its vigil, Harry's untrained magic exploded outward in pure terror, a blast of accidental magic so violent and uncontrolled that it shattered ancient stone walls like glass and sent the massive creature crashing through the castle's foundations into the dungeons below. By dawn, when the first rays of October sunlight struggled through the castle's tall windows, the damage was undeniable and devastating. Fluffy lay motionless in a mountain of rubble 3 floors below, the creature's enormous form twisted at impossible angles among shattered stone and splintered wood. Half the 3rd floor had collapsed into the dungeons, creating a wound in Hogwarts' ancient architecture that would take months to heal. Professor McGonagall's lips pressed into the thinnest line Harry had ever seen as she surveyed the destruction, her usually immaculate robes covered in stone dust and her eyes reflecting a pain that went deeper than disappointment. The deputy headmistress, who had welcomed him to Gryffindor with such pride just weeks earlier, now looked at him as if he were a stranger wearing her student's face. Dumbledore's blue eyes, usually twinkling with hidden knowledge and gentle humour, had gone cold as winter mornings when he emerged from the wreckage carrying the damaged Philosopher's Stone. The greatest wizard of the age stood amid the destruction Harry had wrought, and for the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Harry saw something in those ancient eyes that made his blood freeze: doubt. The Board of Governors would convene within hours, summoned by emergency flu calls that had already begun crackling through the castle's fireplaces, and Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child who had survived the killing curse, the most famous wizard in Britain, would face a punishment that not even his legendary scar could protect him from. What happens when Hogwarts' greatest hero becomes its most dangerous liability? The Great Hall had been transformed overnight into something Harry barely recognized, its warm golden light replaced by the harsh, unforgiving glare of judgment. Where house tables had once stood in welcoming rows, a single chair now sat isolated in the center of the ancient stone floor, surrounded by a semicircle of high-backed seats that loomed like vultures waiting to feast. 12 governors sat in stern-faced silence, their expensive robes and glittering chains of office creating a wall of authority that seemed designed to crush any hope of mercy. Cornelius Fudge shuffled through papers with visible discomfort, his bowler hat slightly askew and his lime green robes wrinkled from an obviously sleepless night. Harry stood alone in the center of this judicial theatre, no longer the celebrated boy who lived, but a frightened 11-year-old who had caused more destruction in 3 weeks than most wizards managed in a lifetime. His Gryffindor robes, once a symbol of belonging and pride, now felt like a costume he had no right to wear. The scarlet and gold seemed to mock him, reminding him of everything he was about to lose. The whispers from the students' gallery cut deeper than any curse. Words like dangerous, uncontrolled, and liability floating through the air like poison gas. These were his classmates. Children had once looked at him with awe and admiration, now staring at him with the kind of fear usually reserved for dark creatures and dangerous spells. Even the Slytherins, who had never liked him, seemed more shocked than satisfied by this turn of events. Professor McGonagall sat at the judge's table with tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She had been the first to welcome him to Hogwarts, the first to see potential in the small boy from Privet Drive, and now she was forced to sit in judgment over the destruction of everything she had hoped he might become. The weight of their collective gaze pressed down on Harry like a physical force, making it hard to breathe, harder still to stand upright. This was what it felt like to be truly alone. Not the loneliness of the Dursleys' house, where at least he could dream of belonging somewhere else, but the complete isolation that came from being cast out by the very world he had thought would save him. Albus Dumbledore rose from his chair with the weight of centuries on his shoulders, his usually straight spine bent as if the events of the past 24 hours had aged him decades in mere moments. His long silver beard, normally so perfectly groomed, showed signs of hasty attention, and his half-moon spectacles caught the harsh light in ways that made his eyes difficult to read. The greatest wizard of the age, architect of victories against the darkest forces in magical history, now faced his greatest challenge, defending the indefensible. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of its usual warmth and certainty. Instead, it wavered with the desperation of a man watching his most carefully laid plans crumble to dust. He spoke of greater purposes that danced just beyond the governor's understanding, of destinies yet unfulfilled that required faith rather than evidence, of a boy who had already saved the wizarding world once through sacrifice, and would do so again through trials yet to come. "Harry Potter is not merely a student," Dumbledore declared, his words echoing in the transformed Great Hall, like incantations. "He is hope made manifest, the living proof that love can triumph over hatred, that light can emerge from the deepest darkness, the magic that flows through him. Yes, sometimes uncontrolled, sometimes dangerous, is the same power that destroyed the most feared dark wizard in our history when he was barely more than a baby." The headmaster gestured toward the rubble that had once been the third floor, his blue eyes blazing with the intensity of conviction. "What you see as destruction I see as potential. What you fear as liability I recognize as strength waiting to be properly channeled. This child carries within him power that could reshape our world for the better, if only we have the wisdom to nurture it rather than the cowardice to cast it aside." But the governors had seen the rubble, counted the cost of repairs that would drain the school's coffers for years to come, and witnessed the terror in their children's eyes when they spoke of what Harry Potter might do next. They had lived through one dark wizard's reign of terror. They would not willingly cultivate another, no matter how noble his intentions might appear. Governor Malfoy leaned forward with predatory satisfaction, his pale eyes glittering with barely concealed triumph. "Noble words, headmaster, but words cannot rebuild shattered walls or resurrect magical creatures killed by uncontrolled power. This boy may have defeated he who must not be named as an infant, but what guarantee do we have that he won't become an even greater threat as he grows older and stronger? Even Dumbledore's legendary influence couldn't overcome the simple, terrifying truth that hung in the air like a curse. Harry Potter had become too dangerous for Hogwarts to contain, and no amount of good intentions could change the mathematics of destruction and fear. The silence that followed the final argument stretched like a held breath, thick with the weight of consequences that would ripple through the wizarding world for years to come. After careful deliberation and with heavy hearts, this emergency tribunal finds that Harry James Potter poses an unacceptable risk to the safety and security of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Therefore, by unanimous decision of the Board of Governors, he is hereby expelled with immediate effect, his wand to be snapped in accordance with the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery. The words echoed through the Great Hall like a death knell, each syllable falling with the finality of tombstones. Harry's world didn't just crack, it shattered more completely than any stone wall ever could. The pieces of his dreams and belongings scattered beyond any hope of repair. The boy who lived, the child who had survived the unsurvivable, discovered that there were some things more devastating than the killing curse. Professor McGonagall's hand trembled like autumn leaves as she approached him with the ceremonial knife used to remove house badges, her face wet with tears she could no longer hold back. The scarlet and gold lion, symbol of courage and belonging, seemed to writhe in protest as she cut it from his robes. When it fell to the stone floor with a soft whisper of fabric, it carried with it every dream Harry had ever dared to have about finding his place in the world. At the Gryffindor table, Ron Weasley's face had gone white as parchment, his freckles standing out like drops of blood against his pale skin. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, as if his brain couldn't process what was happening quickly enough to form words of protest. Hermione openly wept, her usually perfect composure crumbling as she watched her friend's life destroyed by forces none of them could control. Even the Slytherins sat in stunned silence, understanding with the peculiar clarity that children sometimes possess that something fundamental had broken in their world. Draco Malfoy, who had spent weeks crafting cruel taunts about Harry's fame and fortune, now stared with wide eyes that reflected not satisfaction but a kind of horrified fascination. as if witnessing something too terrible to fully comprehend. The scarlet and gold badge lay on the stone floor like a fallen standard, and with it fell the last of Harry Potter's illusions about belonging, about home, about the possibility that fame might somehow protect him from the fundamental loneliness that had haunted him since birth. The portraits along the corridor walls, usually so chatty and interfering, had fallen into respectful silence, as if witnessing a funeral procession. Even the ghosts seemed to fade into translucency when he approached, as though death itself didn't want to be associated with this particular kind of ending. The fat lady's portrait frame stood empty when he passed the Gryffindor common room entrance. She couldn't bear to watch her house lose one of its cubs to such bitter circumstances. His trunk felt impossibly heavy as he dragged it toward the entrance hall, each book and possession inside now a reminder of magical education that would never be completed, of friendships that could never fully recover from this moment. The textbooks he had been so excited to read, the cauldron Hagrid had helped him choose in Diagon Alley, the wand that had chosen him in Ollivander's, all it now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. A boy who had believed he could belong somewhere. Behind him, he could hear the whispered conversations of students trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Some spoke of justice served, others of tragedy unfolding, but all of them spoke of Harry Potter in the past tense, as if he had already ceased to exist in their world. The boy who lived was becoming the boy who left, and there was a finality to that transformation that made his chest ache with unshed tears. Hagrid waited by the oak doors that marked the boundary between belonging and exile, tears streaming down his bearded face like rivers cutting through stone. The gentle giant who had introduced Harry to the wizarding world, who had been the first to show him kindness after years of neglect, now stood as witness to his banishment from everything magical and wonderful. Hagrid's massive hands shook as he tried to find words of comfort. But what comfort could there be for a boy being cast out of paradise? The oak doors that had welcomed Harry home with such promise now loomed before him like the gates of hell, ready to close behind him with crushing finality. As they swung shut with a sound like thunder, Harry Potter discovered the cruelest truth of all. Being famous meant absolutely nothing when you were truly alone. The outside world awaited, cold and unwelcoming. And for the first time since learning he was a wizard, Harry wondered if magic was worth the price of belonging to a world that could discard you so completely. The Dursleys' horror at Harry's unexpected return was matched only by their vindictive satisfaction, their faces cycling through emotions like a twisted kaleidoscope of cruelty and triumph. Vernon's purple complexion deepened to an almost burgundy shade as he absorbed the delicious irony of his nephew's disgrace, his massive form blocking the doorway like a wall of malicious glee. Petunia's thin lips stretched into the first genuine smile Harry had seen her wear since his acceptance letter arrived, her pale eyes glittering with the cold satisfaction of vindicated prejudice. "Thrown out, were you?" Vernon's voice carried a mixture of mock sympathy and barely contained jubilation. "Seems your precious magical world doesn't want you any more than we ever did. Serves you right for getting above your station, boy." Magic. He spat the word like a curse, his small eyes disappearing into folds of flesh as his grin widened. "Load of nonsense, and now even they can see what a freak you really are." Dudley's reaction was perhaps the cruelest of all, his pig-like features lighting up with a comprehension that went beyond his usual dim-witted bullying. He understood instinctively that Harry's fall from grace made him fair game in ways that his previous magical protection had prevented. The taunts that had once been whispered behind closed doors could now be shouted from rooftops, and the physical abuse that had been carefully hidden could emerge into the light of day. They installed locks on Harry's bedroom door that turned his small space into a proper prison, metal fixtures that clicked with the finality of judgment. The bars on his windows, originally installed to keep him in, now seemed designed to keep hope out. His meals, never generous, became grudging offerings pushed through a slot like he was some dangerous animal being fed at the zoo. The magical world had rejected him as thoroughly as the Muggle one always had. leaving him suspended between two forms of abandonment. But in the darkness of his cupboard-sized existence, surrounded by the detritus of his shattered dreams, Harry began to understand that Hogwarts had given him something no expulsion could take away: the knowledge that magic was real, that it flowed through his veins like liquid fire, and that he was part of something larger than the small, cruel world of Privet Drive. They could take away his wand, his robes, his place at school, but they couldn't take away the magic itself. Late at night, when the Dursleys' snores echoed through the house like the rumbling of satisfied predators, Harry would practice moving objects with his mind, making his broken alarm clock tick backward, causing the wallpaper to ripple like water. The accidental magic that had destroyed him at Hogwarts became his secret rebellion at Privet Drive, proof that no matter how many locks they installed, they couldn't cage the part of him that truly mattered. Whether they wanted him or not, Harry Potter was magical, and that truth burned in him like an unquenchable flame. Desperation drove Harry to places no 11-year-old should venture, through back alleys where refuse bins overflowed with the detritus of both magical and muggle worlds, where broken streetlights flickered with electricity that couldn't quite illuminate the shadows that moved between dimensions. Freedom came at the cost of safety when he finally escaped Privet Drive one fog-shrouded November morning, his accidental magic having grown strong enough to melt the locks that held him prisoner. Nocturne Alley's shadows welcomed him with false promises and genuine dangers, its crooked buildings leaning inward like conspirators sharing dark secrets. Here, among the shop windows filled with shrunken heads and cursed artifacts, Harry discovered a London that existed in the spaces between the world he had known and the world he had lost. The cobblestones were slick with substances that could have been rain or blood, and the air tasted of sulphur and broken dreams. The outcasts and exiled who populated these forgotten corners of magical society recognized something familiar in the small boy with the lightning bolt scar, the particular hunger that came from having nowhere else to go. A witch with silver teeth taught him to brew potions that could heal wounds or cause nightmares, depending on the phase of the moon. A wizard missing his left hand showed him how to cast spells without a wand, using nothing but will and fury to bend reality to his desires. Here, among criminals and cast-offs, Harry began to learn magic that Hogwarts would never teach: brutal, efficient spells that cared nothing for ethics or restraint, curses that drew their power from pain rather than proper pronunciation. Each new lesson carved away another piece of the innocent boy who had once dreamed of belonging, replacing him with something harder and infinitely more dangerous. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic like in the stories he had once loved. Instead, it was gradual and inexorable, like erosion wearing away stone. The boy who had once hesitated to use magic against his enemies began to see hexes and curses as tools no different from hammers or knives. The child who had wanted desperately to fit in started to understand that there was power in standing apart, strength in being feared rather than loved. When winter came to London, bringing with it the kind of cold that seeped into bones and stayed there, Harry found shelter in the underground tunnels that honeycombed the city like a vast nervous system. Here, surrounded by others who had been discarded by society, he learned the most important lesson of all. Survival was its own form of magic, and those who mastered it became something beyond the reach of ordinary judgment. The wizarding world had cast him out, but in doing so, they had created something they couldn't control: a young wizard with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. When Death Eater remnants cornered him in a muggle alley behind King's Cross Station, Harry discovered that survival required more than famous scars and childhood luck, more than the protection of a name that had once carried the weight of legend. 3 figures emerged from the February darkness like nightmares given form, their masks gleaming white as bone in the sickly yellow light of street lamps that had witnessed too much violence to properly illuminate anything. The leader, a wizard whose voice carried the refined cruelty of old magical families, seemed amused by what he saw. Harry Potter, he drawled, the name dripping from his lips like poison honey. The boy who lived, reduced to scavenging in Muggle gutters like a common rat. How the mighty have fallen. Our master will be most pleased to learn how thoroughly his enemies have destroyed themselves. But Harry was no longer the frightened 11-year-old who had stood trial in the Great Hall, no longer the innocent child who had believed that being good was enough to protect him from the world's cruelties. Months of survival in London's magical underground had burned away his naivety like acid, leaving behind something that even these hardened Death Eaters weren't prepared to face. His attackers fled into the night, their robes singed and their dignity in tatters, but not before Harry saw something in their eyes that chilled him more than London's winter wind. It was the same fear he had seen in the faces of Hogwarts students when they looked at him after the third-floor incident, the recognition that he had become something uncontrolled and uncontrollable, a force of nature wearing the shape of a 12-year-old boy. The boy who had once wanted nothing more than to belong somewhere had learned to find belonging in his own strength, and that was perhaps the most dangerous transformation of all. His name still carried power throughout the wizarding world, but now it inspired fear rather than hope, whispered in the same hushed tones once reserved for he who must not be named. Shopkeepers in Diagon Alley would cross themselves when his name appeared in conversation, and even hardened auras felt a chill when briefed about sightings of a young wizard with a lightning bolt scar performing impossible magic in impossible places. The stories that filtered back to civilized magical society painted a picture that defied easy categorization. Harry Potter had been seen healing Muggle children in East London hospitals, his touch bringing back the dead and dying with power that shouldn't exist. The same Harry Potter had been spotted in Knockturn Alley, trading curses with dark wizards twice his age and emerging victorious from battles that should have killed him. He saved the innocent and destroyed the wicked with equal efficiency, as if he had appointed himself judge, jury and executioner for all of magical Britain. Ministry officials debated endlessly about what to do with him. But how do you arrest someone who exists in the spaces between laws, who helps more people than he hurts, but does both in ways that terrify everyone who witnesses them? He was a hero and a villain, a savior and a threat, a child and something far more ancient and dangerous. The categories that had once defined their world seemed inadequate when applied to what Harry Potter had become. In the depths of his exile, surrounded by the forgotten and discarded people who had become his true family, Harry began to understand that perhaps Dumbledore had been right about one thing. He did have a destiny to fulfill, a role to play in the great cosmic drama that seemed to define the wizarding world. But it would be nothing like the destiny anyone had planned for him, nothing like the neat, heroic narrative that Hogwarts had tried to write for his life. He would be neither the compliant weapon Dumbledore had attempted to forge, nor the broken victim the Dursleys had tried to create. Instead, Harry Potter would become something entirely new, a force of nature that owed allegiance to no one but himself and the people he chose to protect, regardless of whether they deserved that protection or not. Hermione Granger had always believed that every problem had a solution hidden somewhere in the library's endless stacks, that the right combination of research and determination could unlock any mystery the world might present. The Hogwarts Library had become her sanctuary in ways it had never been before, its towering shelves of ancient texts and forbidden knowledge now representing her only hope of undoing the catastrophe that had befallen her friend. As autumn melted into winter and still no word came from Harry, even her encyclopedic knowledge couldn't fill the growing void his absence had carved in her world. She haunted the restricted section like a ghost, her special permissions from Professor McGonagall allowing her access to texts that most 7th years would never see, legal precedents from the 13th century, appeals processes that hadn't been used since the Goblin Rebellions, obscure constitutional provisions that might provide a loophole large enough for one wrongfully expelled boy to slip through. The books she studied painted a grim picture of wizarding justice. Expulsions from Hogwarts were rare, but historically final, the Board of Governors' decisions carrying the weight of law and tradition that stretched back nearly 1,000 years. Students had been cast out for dark magic, for attacking teachers, for for crimes that threatened the very foundation of magical society, but never in all her research had Hermione found a case quite like Harry's. Ron tried to help, his presence a comfort even when his contributions to the research were minimal, but she could see the guilt eating away at him like acid, the way his shoulders sagged whenever Harry's name was mentioned, the haunted look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. He had stood frozen in the Great Hall when his best friend needed him most, and that moment of paralysis had become a weight he carried like a stone in his chest. There has to be something, Hermione whispered to herself for the 1000th time, her voice barely audible in the library's cathedral silence. Her fingers traced the faded text of a legal tome from the 17th century, searching for precedents that might not exist, hoping for miracles that the law rarely provided. There has to be a way to bring him home. But as the weeks stretched into months and her pile of research grew higher while her hope grew smaller, Hermione began to understand a truth that no amount of studying could change. Some problems couldn't be solved with books and cleverness. Some mistakes, once made, carved scars too deep for even magic to heal. And sometimes the very system you trusted to protect the innocent became the instrument of their destruction, wrapped in the respectability of procedure and the authority of tradition. The castle itself seemed diminished without Harry Potter's presence, as if his expulsion had drained something essential from its ancient stones and left behind a hollow echo of what it had once been. Students walked the corridors with a subdued energy that felt wrong in a place that had always thrummed with youthful exuberance, their conversations quieter, their laughter less frequent, as though Harry's absence had reminded them all how quickly belonging could be stripped away. Professor Snape taught with even more venom than usual, his already considerable cruelty sharpened to a razor's edge that cut deeper than ever before. But perceptive students noticed something different in his behavior. Without Harry Potter to torment, the potion's master seemed almost purposeless, like a hunter who had lost his favorite prey. His insults lacked their usual surgical precision, delivered with the mechanical efficiency of habit rather than the passionate hatred that had once made them so devastating. The defense against the dark arts position remained cursed in ways that went beyond mere superstition. Quirrell had vanished entirely after the Philosopher's Stone incident, leaving behind only rumours and the lingering smell of garlic that seemed to haunt the third-floor corridor. His replacement, a nervous witch from the Ministry who jumped at shadows and taught from textbooks with trembling hands, lasted exactly 3 weeks before submitting her resignation via Howler. A succession of increasingly inadequate substitutes followed, each one lasting shorter than the last, as if the position itself had become toxic in ways that even magical contracts couldn't overcome. Students began to joke darkly that Harry Potter's explosive departure had cursed the defense position even more thoroughly than whatever dark magic had originally afflicted it. But the laughter felt forced and hollow. Even the other students felt the change that had settled over Hogwarts like a shroud. Neville Longbottom, always sensitive to the emotional currents that flowed through the castle, cowered more than ever, his already fragile confidence shattered by witnessing what could happen to anyone who drew too much attention. Draco Malfoy's taunts lacked their usual satisfaction. Without Harry Potter to torment, his cruelty felt petty and pointless, like arrows shot at empty air. The very atmosphere of the school had shifted from one of magical wonder to something more cautious and fearful. First years no longer explored the castle with the same eager curiosity, too aware that forbidden corridors might lead to expulsion rather than adventure. Most unsettling of all was the way the castle's magic itself seemed to mourn Harry's absence. Portraits remained silent when students passed. The moving staircases seemed less playful in their movements, and even the house elves worked with a melancholy efficiency that suggested they understood something fundamental had been lost. Hogwarts had expelled one of its own, and the school would never quite feel like home in the same way again. Albus Dumbledore had orchestrated countless plans across his long and storied life, weaving schemes that spanned decades and involved hundreds of players moving across the chessboard of magical politics, like pieces in a game only he fully understood. Voldemort's return felt increasingly inevitable with each passing day. The signs and portents that Dumbledore's network reported painting a picture of a Dark Lord preparing to reclaim his throne. But the weapon he had spent years preparing, the child who was supposed to fulfill an ancient prophecy and bring balance to their world, was lost somewhere in the wilderness of magical Britain, like an arrow shot into fog. His network of allies brought him fragments of rumors that only deepened his desperation, sightings of a young wizard with a lightning bolt scar, performing impossible magic in impossible places. Stories that painted Harry Potter as something far removed from the manageable hero Dumbledore had envisioned. The boy was healing incurable diseases in Muggle hospitals, defeating dark wizards in single combat, and gathering followers from the dregs of magical society with the charisma of a prophet and the power of something approaching divinity. Each report made it clearer that Harry Potter was becoming something beyond Dumbledore's ability to predict or control. A force that operated by its own moral code rather than the carefully structured narrative the headmaster had tried to create. The child who should have been a sword to wield against darkness was forging himself into something that might cut both ways, and Dumbledore found himself in the unprecedented position of fearing his own greatest hope. Late at night, alone in his office, surrounded by the artifacts and memories of a lifetime spent fighting darkness, Dumbledore would stare at the broken remains of Harry's Hogwarts acceptance letter and wonder if he had created the very monster he had sought to prevent. Had his manipulations, his carefully orchestrated trials, his willingness to sacrifice innocence for the greater good, transformed his chosen champion into something worse than the enemy they faced? The most terrifying possibility of all was that Harry Potter might be exactly what the wizarding world needed, and that need might be too terrible for any of them to survive. In the absence of Harry Potter, other names began to whisper through the halls of power, like leaves blown by an uncertain wind, carrying with them the desperate hope that destiny might be transferable from one person to another. The Ministry's think tanks worked overtime to identify potential replacements, young wizards who might be molded into the hero their world so desperately needed. But every candidate fell short of the impossible standard that the boy who lived had set. Neville Longbottom, whose parents had suffered fates worse than death for the same cause that had orphaned Harry, suddenly found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never wanted and was utterly unprepared to handle. Ministry officials began appearing at Hogwarts with increasing frequency, their eyes following the round-faced boy with an intensity that made his hands shake and his stutter return with vengeance. They spoke in hushed tones about alternative prophecies, about the possibility that the Chosen One might have been misidentified, about the urgent need for a new symbol of hope. But Neville lacked everything that had made Harry Potter special: the natural defiance that turned every challenge into a personal affront, the intuitive grasp of magic that allowed impossible feats to seem routine, the indefinable charisma that made even enemies respect him. Where Harry had blazed through Hogwarts like a comet, leaving trails of wonder and destruction in equal measure, Neville stumbled through his days like a ghost, terrified that someone might notice him long enough to expect greatness. The attempts to mold him into a replacement hero were as painful as they were futile. Ministry-sponsored training sessions left him exhausted and demoralized, his magical abilities stretched beyond their natural limits in desperate attempts to find power that simply wasn't there. The press followed him with cameras and quills, documenting every stumble and mistake, as if they were witnessing the birth of legend, rather than the slow torture of an innocent child. Even his own grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, seemed caught between pride and disappointment as she watched her grandson fail to measure up to expectations no mortal child should be asked to meet. Her letters became increasingly strained, filled with advice about posture and pronunciation that couldn't address the fundamental truth that Neville was exactly what he appeared to be: a good, kind, ordinary boy who deserved better than being asked to replace the irreplaceable. Each attempt to force Neville into Harry's abandoned role only highlighted how unique Harry Potter truly was. how specific and unreproducible the combination of circumstances that had created their lost champion. The wizarding world was learning too late that some destinies could not be transferred from one person to another like family heirlooms, that the power to inspire hope and terror in equal measure was not something that could be manufactured through training and expectation. They had cast out their greatest hope and now discovered that hope, once broken, could not be easily replaced. The boy who lived was gone, and no amount of desperate searching could fill the void he had left behind. When Severus Snape appeared in the grimy alley where Harry had been hiding, materializing from the February shadows like a black-robed spectre of judgment, the last thing either of them expected was to find common ground in the ruins of their mutual hatred. The potions master's pale face showed none of its usual sneer, replaced instead by something that might have been recognition, as if he was seeing Harry Potter clearly for the first time since that autumn night when everything had gone wrong. "Potter," Snape said, his voice lacking its customary venom and carrying instead a weariness that seemed to age him decades in the space of a single word. He stood at the mouth of the alley like a guardian angel dressed in midnight, his black robes billowing in the winter wind, and his dark eyes reflecting something that looked disturbingly like understanding. The confrontation Harry had expected never came. Instead, Snape began to speak of things that shattered Harry's understanding of the world more completely than any spell ever could. He revealed the depth of Dumbledore's manipulations with the clinical precision of a surgeon, laying bare infected wounds, the careful orchestration of Harry's childhood abuse, deliberately placing him with relatives who would break his spirit and make him grateful for any kindness, the deliberate withholding of crucial information about his heritage, his parents, his own nature and abilities, the cold calculation that had treated Harry as a weapon to be forged rather than a child to be protected. "You think yourself a monster," Snape continued, his words cutting through the winter air like knives made of truth. "But you are merely a victim of a monster far more subtle and far more dangerous than you could ever become. Dumbledore shaped you from birth to be his perfect martyr, his willing sacrifice, his controllable weapon. Your expulsion was not the failure of his plans, it was the failure of his control. Here in this forgotten corner of London, where refuse bins overflowed with the detritus of two worlds, two souls damaged by the same man's greater good, found themselves staring across a divide that suddenly seemed less insurmountable than either had imagined. Snape's hatred of Harry had been built on foundations of projection and pain, seeing James Potter's arrogance in every gesture of his son. But the boy who stood before him now, hardened by months of survival and abandonment, bore no resemblance to the privileged bully who had tormented him decades earlier. In Harry's eyes, Snape saw the same weary knowledge that looked back at him from mirrors, the understanding that came from being used and discarded by people who claimed to love you, and in that shared pain, something impossible began to form. Not friendship perhaps, but something deeper and more valuable. Alliance born from mutual recognition of wounds that would never fully heal. They were both Dumbledore's victims, both casualties of the greater good, both survivors of manipulation so subtle and complete that it had taken years to recognize it for what it was. The prophecy that had shaped Harry's entire existence crumbled under Snape's bitter revelations like ancient parchment exposed to flame. Each word of the supposedly sacred text revealed to be built on foundations of misinterpretation and willful blindness. They sat in the abandoned underground station that had become Harry's sanctuary, surrounded by his followers who listened with the intensity of disciples receiving gospel. As Snape dissected the lies that had defined their world. "The power he knows not," Snape repeated, his voice dripping with decades of accumulated contempt for Dumbledore's manipulations. "Love," the old fool claimed. "The protection your mother's sacrifice gave you. Pretty words that sound noble in the telling, but consider the evidence of your own experience, Potter. What power did love give you when your relatives locked you in cupboards? What protection did it offer when Hogwarts cast you out like refuse?" The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more terrifying than any of them had imagined. The power the prophecy spoke of was not love or friendship or any of the comfortable emotions Dumbledore had championed in his speeches. It was the raw, uncontrolled magic that Hogwarts had been so desperate to suppress. The force that had shattered stone walls and sent a three-headed dog crashing through floors. It was chaos given form, destruction and creation dancing together in ways that terrified those who preferred their magic neat and categorizable. Dumbledore spent years trying to channel your abilities into acceptable forms. Snape continued, his dark eyes glittering in the flickering light of magical flames that burned without fuel. He never understood that your greatest strength lay in your very unpredictability, in the way your magic defied every attempt to contain or control it. The expulsion didn't destroy Harry Potter, it finally set him free to become what he was always meant to be. The revelation recontextualized everything Harry had experienced, transforming his greatest shame into his most valuable asset. The accidental magic that had marked him as dangerous was revealed to be the very thing that made him unique, the power that no Dark Lord could replicate or defend against because it operated outside the boundaries of conventional magical theory. Voldemort, for all his knowledge and skill, was still bound by the rules and limitations that had been drilled into him during his own Hogwarts education. Harry had been forced to learn magic from the ground up, unencumbered by the assumptions and restrictions that hampered even the most powerful wizards. Tom Riddle's resurrection in a graveyard meant for forgotten souls marked the true beginning of a war that would reshape magical Britain in ways that neither side could predict or control. His rebirth, witnessed only by the moss-covered headstones of wizards whose names had been lost to time and the skeletal trees that reached toward a moonless sky like grasping fingers. The ritual that restored his body was both ancient and improvised, drawing power from sources that modern wizards preferred not to acknowledge, and the result was something that bore only passing resemblance to the Dark Lord who had terrorized their world a decade earlier. But this time, there was no Harry Potter standing ready to oppose him, no convenient prophecy to guide their conflict into neat channels of hero versus villain. The child who should have been his greatest enemy had been cast out by the very people who needed his protection, leaving Voldemort to face a world that had defeated itself more thoroughly than any dark magic ever could. The irony was so perfect, so exquisitely cruel, that even a mind as twisted as his could appreciate the artistic beauty of his enemy's self-destruction. Instead of the organized resistance he had expected, Voldemort found himself confronting a magical Britain that had fractured along lines of fear and suspicion. The Ministry stumbled through each day like a drunk man walking a tightrope, their policies swinging between desperate appeasement and reckless aggression as they tried to address threats they couldn't properly identify. Hogwarts cowered behind wards that had been strengthened to the point of paranoia, its students learning to fear their own magic almost as much as they feared his return. The resistance that should have formed around the boy who lived never materialized, leaving only scattered groups of Aurors and Order members who fought with the desperation of people who knew they were already beaten. Dumbledore's careful plans lay in ruins, his network of allies paralyzed by the absence of the weapon they had counted on to lead them to victory. But the most unsettling development for the returned Dark Lord was the rumors that filtered back from London's magical underground. Stories about a young wizard with a lightning bolt scar who had gathered an army from society's outcasts and rejects. Harry Potter had not vanished into obscurity as Voldemort had hoped. He had transformed into something unpredictable and potentially more dangerous than a mere prophesied hero. The Dark Lord's laughter echoed across the graveyard as he realized the full scope of the gift his enemies had given him. They had cast out their greatest defender, broken their most powerful weapon, and handed him victory more completely than any battle ever could. But as his mirth faded into the night air, Tom Riddle began to understand that wars fought without rules or prophecies to guide them were far more dangerous than the neat conflict he had originally planned. Word of Voldemort's return had reached them through the same underground networks that had sustained Harry during his exile. carried by refugees and deserters who spoke of a Dark Lord more terrible than memory had preserved. The wizarding world that had cast him out was now facing the very threat they had relied on him to defeat, and their desperate pleas for aid carried the bitter taste of irony that even Harry could appreciate. He could return to fight for the world that had expelled him, stepping back into the role of hero and savior that had been thrust upon him since birth. The gesture would be magnanimous, the stuff of legends that would be told for centuries, the prodigal son returning to save those who had rejected him, proving that love could triumph over abandonment and forgiveness could overcome even the deepest wounds. It would be the noble choice, the one that storybooks and prophecies would celebrate. Or he could walk away, leaving them to face the consequences of their own judgment and learn the true cost of casting out their greatest protector. He could take his followers and disappear into the wider world, building something new and free from the corruption and prejudice that had defined magical Britain for too long. It would be the practical choice, the one that prioritized the people who had stood by him over those who had betrayed him. But as Harry stood in that moment of decision, weighing loyalty against abandonment and forgiveness against justice, he began to understand that both choices were traps designed by other people's expectations. The wizarding world wanted him to be their savior, while his followers expected him to be their leader. Neither side truly cared what Harry Potter wanted for himself. They only cared about what he could do for them. In that moment of clarity, standing at the crossroads of destiny, with the weight of two worlds pressing down on his shoulders, Harry Potter finally gained the one thing that Dumbledore's manipulations had never been able to give him, and Hogwarts education had never been able to teach him: the power to choose his own destiny, free from prophecies and expectations, and the desperate needs of people who saw him as a weapon rather than a person. The choice he made would surprise everyone, including himself, because it would be neither the noble path nor the practical one, but something entirely new, a third option that no one had imagined possible. Harry's call to arms didn't echo through the halls of Hogwarts or the polished corridors of the Ministry, carried instead through whispered conversations in Knockturn Alley and coded messages passed between the hands of those whom magical society had forgotten or deliberately ignored. His recruitment strategy was as unconventional as everything else about his transformation from hero to exile. He sought not the brave and the powerful, but the desperate and the discarded, those who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. They came from the shadows of magical Britain like moths drawn to a flame that promised warmth rather than destruction. Squibs who had been denied their magical heritage, forced to live as second-class citizens in a world that measured worth by the ability to wave a wand, arrived with decades of resentment burning in their eyes, and skills that most wizards had never bothered to learn. Half-breeds pushed to the margins by prejudice older than memory, brought with them the particular fury that came from being judged by blood rather than character. Criminals seeking redemption found in Harry something they had never encountered in the Ministry's courts, not forgiveness, which was cheap and meaningless, but the possibility of transformation, of becoming something better than what society had labelled them. These were not the casual lawbreakers who stole cauldrons or cheated at Quidditch, but the serious criminals who had committed the kind of crimes that ended with Azkaban sentences, who understood violence and loss in ways that textbook heroes never could. Survivors of Voldemort's first reign, the ones who had been forgotten by history's heroes and ignored by the victory celebrations, brought with them knowledge that no amount of training could replicate. They knew what it meant to fight a war against an enemy who respected no boundaries, who would torture children to break their parents and murder families to send messages. These were the people who had lived through darkness and emerged scarred but unbroken, who understood that sometimes the only way to fight monsters was to become something equally monstrous. Each new arrival added another thread to the tapestry. Harry was weaving an army united not by noble causes or patriotic fervour, but by the simple recognition that the world had written them off, and they refused to accept that judgment. They came not for glory or recognition, which their society would never grant them anyway, but because Harry Potter offered them something precious beyond measure, a chance to matter in a war that had already decided they were expendable. In the depths of London's forgotten places, where magic mixed with desperation and hope took root in the most unlikely soil, Harry Potter's true army began to take shape. Not the shining host of legend, but something far more dangerous. People with nothing left to lose, and a leader who understood exactly how that felt. Deep beneath London's bustling streets, in tunnels that had been forgotten by both magical and Muggle authorities since the Blitz had driven people underground in search of safety from a different kind of darkness, Harry established his stronghold in a place that existed between worlds. The abandoned underground stations that honeycombed the city like a vast nervous system provided the perfect foundation for a fortress that needed to hide from both governmental oversight and Dark Lord surveillance. Ancient wards, their origins lost to time, but their power undimmed by decades of neglect, met modern ingenuity as Harry's followers transformed these forgotten spaces into something that would have impressed even Hogwarts founders. Muggle electrical systems powered by magic provided light without the telltale signatures that Ministry detection spells looked for, while communication networks that borrowed from both Wizard wireless and Muggle telephone exchanges created an information web that spanned the entire city. The transformation of the tunnels reflected the unique nature of Harry's army, with each group contributing skills that complemented rather than competed with the others. Former curse breakers who had been blacklisted by Gringotts for asking too many questions about goblin labor practices wove protective enchantments that would have taken Ministry teams months to penetrate. Squib engineers who understood both magical theory and Muggle technology created hybrid systems that operated on principles neither side fully comprehended, but both found impossible to counter. Hermione and Ron arrived under cover of darkness on a rain-soaked April night, their school robes exchanged for the practical gear of rebels and their faces showing the strain of months spent watching their world tear itself apart. Their reunion with Harry was bittersweet in ways that no amount of preparation could have lessened. He was no longer the boy they had befriended on the Hogwarts Express, but neither were they still the children who had watched him be expelled from the only home he had ever known. The changes in all three of them ran deeper than the obvious physical alterations, though those were striking enough. Harry had grown taller and broader, his shoulders carrying the weight of leadership with a confidence that seemed impossible in someone barely 13 years old. But it was the changes in his eyes that were most disturbing. The innocence that had survived even the Dursleys' cruelty had been burned away by months of survival, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Ron and Hermione had changed too, their comfortable assumptions about good and evil, about the inherent justice of their world's institutions, shattered by the reality of what had happened to their friend and what was happening to their society. They came not as rescuers bringing him home, but as converts seeking sanctuary in a new kind of family built on loyalty, rather than blood or house sorting. The magic Harry taught his followers bore no resemblance to Hogwarts' carefully structured curriculum, with its emphasis on proper wand movement and precise pronunciation, its neat categories that separated acceptable spells from forbidden ones, based on the comfort level of people who had never faced real danger. This was magic born from necessity and refined through survival, techniques that prioritized effectiveness over ethics and results over respectability. His students learned to fight dirty in ways that would have horrified their former professors, using their opponents' expectations and prejudices against them like weapons more devastating than any curse. A squib who couldn't cast a proper stunning spell could still bring down a Death Eater with Muggle martial arts, or cleverly placed explosives that magical defenses weren't designed to detect. A half-giant who faced discrimination because of her size could use that same physical advantage to devastating effect when enemies underestimated her intelligence because of their prejudice. The training sessions took place in the deepest parts of their underground complex, in chambers where the ancient stones had been warded against detection, and the walls were thick enough to contain even the most volatile magical experiments. Here, Harry passed on everything he had learned during his months of exile, not just spells and techniques, but the mindset that separated survivors from victims, the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect the people who mattered. When Neville Longbottom arrived, seeking training on a fog-shrouded night in late spring, slipping away from Hogwarts through passages he had learned from the Marauder's map that Hermione had somehow acquired, Harry saw in his old doormate the same fire that had driven him from comfortable exile into dangerous rebellion. The round-faced boy who had once cowered from Snape's insults and Draco's taunts had been transformed by months of watching his world crumble, his natural courage finally finding expression in the absence of institutions that had spent years teaching him to be afraid of his own shadow. Neville's transformation under Harry's tutelage was perhaps the most remarkable of all. His bumbling incompetence revealed to be largely the result of using borrowed wands and following teaching methods designed for completely different types of magical talent. Given training that worked with his natural abilities rather than against them, Neville blossomed into exactly the kind of wizard his parents would have been proud to call their son. The magic they learned was not the sanitized version taught in classrooms, but the raw, practical sorcery that people used when their lives depended on the outcome. They learned to turn their perceived weaknesses into devastating strengths, to use the very prejudices that had marginalized them as tactical advantages in conflicts where survival mattered more than following the rules. Their first mission was both rescue and statement, a carefully planned operation that would liberate Muggle-born wizards from Ministry, holding cells while simultaneously proving that Harry Potter had not been broken by his expulsion, but transformed into something far more dangerous than a compliant hero. The target was a detention facility that officially didn't exist, buried so deep in Ministry paperwork that even most Aurors weren't aware of its location. The rescue itself unfolded with the precision of a military operation and the savage efficiency of people who understood that failure meant not just their own deaths, but the continued suffering of innocents. Harry's army moved through the Ministry's lower levels, like ghosts, their mixed magical and Muggle techniques allowing them to bypass detection systems that had been designed to catch conventional wizards using conventional methods. Squib technicians disabled electronic security systems with skills they had learned in the Muggle world, while half-blood curse breakers unraveled magical protections using techniques their pure-blood colleagues had never bothered to study. The guards, expecting to face either bumbling amateurs or traditional dark wizards, found themselves completely unprepared for enemies who fought with tactics borrowed from both worlds and limited by the ethics of neither. The prisoners they liberated painted a picture of Ministry justice that would have horrified anyone who still believed in the inherent goodness of their institutions. These were not criminals or terrorists, but ordinary witches and wizards whose only crime was being born to Muggle parents at a time when such heritage had become a liability. They had been held without trial, without legal representation, without even the basic dignity of being told what crimes they were accused of committing. And Dumbledore, reading the reports in his office high above Hogwarts while the rescued prisoners gave interviews to underground publications that somehow reached every magical household in Britain, finally understood the magnitude of his greatest mistake. He had tried to forge a weapon and instead had created a force of nature, something that operated by its own moral code and answered to no authority but its own sense of justice. The boy who lived was gone, replaced by something infinitely more complex and dangerous. A young man who had learned that sometimes the only way to save the innocent was to become everything their oppressors feared most. When Death Eaters surrounded Hogwarts in the dead of winter, their dark marks burning against a sky heavy with snow and malice, Harry Potter returned to the castle that had expelled him, not as a student seeking remission or a supplicant begging for forgiveness, but as a general commanding an army that had been forged in the fires of rejection and tempered by months of guerrilla warfare against forces that most wizards preferred to pretend didn't exist. The irony was not lost on anyone who witnessed his approach across the snow-covered grounds where he had once played Quidditch and learned to fly, where he had discovered friendship and belonging before learning how quickly both could be stripped away. He walked through the same massive oak doors that had closed behind him in disgrace, But now he was flanked by followers who would die for him rather than teachers who had failed to protect him, surrounded by an army that had chosen him rather than a school that had cast him out. The sight of him striding through the entrance hall sent ripples of shock and recognition through the assembled defenders, students and professors alike struggling to reconcile the small boy they remembered with the young man who now commanded their attention with presence alone. He was taller than they remembered, his shoulders broader from months of physical training, but it was the changes in his eyes that truly marked his transformation. The innocence that had somehow survived even the Dursleys' cruelty had been burned away, replaced by the weary knowledge that came from seeing too much of the world's darkness too young. Professor McGonagall's face was a study in conflicted emotions, as she watched her former students stride through halls he was no longer welcome in, every step a reminder of how completely they had failed him, and how thoroughly he had succeeded despite their failure. The Transfiguration professor who had once removed his house badge with trembling hands now found herself grateful for his presence, even as she struggled to understand how the broken boy she had helped to expel had transformed into this confident leader who seemed to fill every space he entered. Behind Harry came his army, not the shining host of legend that filled children's stories, but something far more real and infinitely more dangerous. Squibs whose existence most wizards preferred to ignore, half-breeds who had been pushed to the margins of society, criminals who had found redemption in service to something larger than themselves. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to fight wars that others preferred to pretend weren't happening, their mixed magical and muggle equipment marking them as something entirely new in the wizarding world's long history of conflict. The students who had once whispered about Harry's dangerous magic now pressed against corridor walls to watch him pass, their faces showing the complex mixture of fear and hope that seemed to define everyone's reaction to what he had become. Dumbledore's request for Harry's aid came delivered through intermediaries and wrapped in the kind of careful diplomatic language that acknowledged reality while avoiding uncomfortable truths, but the message beneath the polite words was clear enough. We need you, even though we cast you out, even though we failed you, even though we have no right to ask for your help after what we did to you. The meeting took place in the headmaster's office, that circular room filled with whirring silver instruments and portraits of dead headmasters who watched the proceedings with interest that bordered on fascination. The old man who sat behind the carved desk bore little resemblance to the confident manipulator who had once moved Harry around like a chess piece in games. The boy wasn't allowed to understand. Months of watching his carefully laid plans crumble had aged Dumbledore in ways that simple time could never accomplish, his usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain that no amount of magical grooming could fully conceal. The twinkle in his blue eyes had been replaced by something that might have been desperation, though he was far too skilled a politician to let it show openly. But Harry was no longer the child who had once craved the old wizard's approval, no longer the innocent boy who had believed that adults always knew what was best, and that authority figures could be trusted to protect those under their care. Months of leading people who had been failed by every institution they had ever trusted had taught Harry lessons that no classroom could provide, and he sat across from Dumbledore, not as a student facing a teacher, but as one leader negotiating with another. He set his terms with ruthless clarity that would have impressed Voldemort himself, complete autonomy in the defense of the school, with no interference from ministry officials or board of governors, full pardons for all his followers, regardless of their past crimes or current legal status, access to Hogwarts resources and libraries without restriction, and most importantly, a formal acknowledgement that his expulsion had been a mistake that would be rectified in the historical record. The negotiation played out against the backdrop of battle raging outside, Death Eaters probing the school's defences while two of the most powerful wizards in Britain haggled over the terms of salvation like merchants. Arguing over the price of grain, Dumbledore's portrait gallery watched with the fascination of people witnessing history being made, former headmasters who had dealt with crises of their own, but nothing quite like the spectacle of their successor begging for help from a boy he had cast out. The most unsettling aspect of the entire meeting was how completely the power dynamic had shifted. Harry no longer seeking approval or validation, but offering assistance from a position of strength to someone who had fallen from the heights of authority to the depths of desperate need. When they finally reached an agreement, sealed with handshakes that carried the weight of magical contracts, Harry Potter officially returned to Hogwarts, not as a student or even as a graduate, but as something entirely new in the school's thousand-year history, an independent contractor hired to save the institution that had expelled him. The heart of Hogwarts became a battlefield as Death Eaters breached the castle's ancient defences through methods that would have been impossible when the school was at full strength, their dark magic finding purchase in wounds that fear and division had already carved in the institution's foundations. But instead of the cowering students and overwhelmed professors they expected to find, the invaders discovered something that defied every assumption they had made about their enemy's capabilities and resolve. Harry Potter's carefully trained army met them with tactics that belonged to no military manual, and strategies that had been born from necessity rather than taught in classrooms. The Great Hall, that cathedral of learning and tradition where Harry had first been sorted into Gryffindor, became a theatre of war where magical theory met brutal reality and comfortable assumptions died under the weight of desperate circumstances. The battle was unlike anything in the wizarding world's recorded history, a savage collision between traditional magical combat and the hybrid techniques that Harry's followers had developed during their months underground. Death Eaters who expected to face frightened children wielding textbook spells instead found themselves confronting enemies who fought with everything from ancient curses to muggle explosives, who used the castle's own architecture as a weapon and turned centuries of magical tradition into tactical advantages. Neville Longbottom, the boy who had once been too frightened to speak up in class, carved through enemy ranks with spells that would have horrified his former professors, and strategies that proved just how completely his training under Harry had transformed him. The round-faced child who had cowered from Snape's insults now moved through the battle like an avatar of destruction, his magic finally unleashed from the constraints that years of fear had placed upon it. Harry himself fought at the centre of the storm, his magic flowing around him like visible force that bent reality to his will, and carved paths through enemy formations that should have been impossible for any single wizard to create. Students who had once whispered about his dangerous magic now watched in awe as that same power saved their lives, their terror transformed into something approaching worship as they witnessed what Harry Potter had become in the months since his expulsion. The Death Eaters, for all their training and experience, found themselves completely unprepared for enemies who refused to fight by the established rules of magical combat. These were not the ritualized duels that had defined previous conflicts, but something far more savage and immediate. A war where survival mattered more than honor and victory was measured in lives saved rather than battles won with style. When the last Death Eater fell or fled, the Great Hall lay in ruins that mirrored the destruction Harry had once caused on the third floor, but this time the devastation felt like victory rather than failure. The castle was safe. The students were alive, and Harry Potter had proven that his power could protect as effectively as it had once destroyed. In the ruins of the Astronomy Tower, where stars watched through gaps in the stone ceiling and winter wind whistled through holes that curses had carved in ancient walls, Harry Potter finally faced Tom Riddle as an equal rather than a victim of prophecy or a player in someone else's game. The confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Voldemort returned, but neither of them could have predicted the form it would take, or the fundamental ways both had changed since their last encounter. The Dark Lord who stood amid the rubble bore only passing resemblance to the memory Harry had faced in the Chamber of Secrets, or the spectre that had haunted his nightmares for years. Resurrection had not restored Tom Riddle to his former power, but had created something else entirely, a being caught between life and death, sustained by magic so dark and desperate that it seemed to warp the very air around him into something cold and lifeless. But Harry too was transformed beyond easy recognition, no longer bound by Dumbledore's careful plans or society's expectations, no longer constrained by the need to be good rather than effective. Months of leading people who had nowhere else to turn had burned away the last of his childhood innocence, replacing it with something harder and infinitely more dangerous than prophecy had ever suggested he might become. Their duel was not the neat resolution of a fairy tale or the ritualized combat that had defined previous conflicts between light and dark. Instead, it became a savage contest between two wizards who had transcended the normal boundaries of magical combat, who fought with techniques that belonged to no established school of sorcery and strategies that had been born from desperation rather than taught in classrooms. Magic flowed around them like visible force, bending reality in ways that should have been impossible and creating effects that no textbook had ever described. The tower shook under the impact of spells that drew their power from sources most wizards preferred not to acknowledge, while the very foundations of the castle groaned under the pressure of magic being used in ways its builders had never intended. Harry fought with a freedom that Voldemort had never encountered in any opponent, his techniques drawing from sources as diverse as the Muggle martial arts his squib followers had taught him, and the ancient magics he had learned from criminals and outcasts who understood power in ways that Hogwarts professors never could. He was no longer trying to be the hero of anyone's story, no longer constrained by the need to fight nobly or win cleanly. When the Dark Lord finally fell, it was not to destiny or love or any of the comfortable emotions that filled children's stories. Instead, Tom Riddle was defeated by the raw power of a young man who had been forged in the fires of rejection and abandonment, who had learned that survival was its own form of magic, and that sometimes the only way to protect innocence was to sacrifice your own. Victory tasted like ash in Harry Potter's mouth as he stood among the ruins of the only home he had ever known, Voldemort's body cooling at his feet, while snow fell through gaps in the astronomy tower's damaged ceiling, like tears from a sky that had seen too much destruction to remain unmarked. The Dark Lord was dead, the war was over, but the cost had been devastating in ways that went far beyond the obvious casualties lying still beneath white sheets in the hospital wing. Too many friends lay silent in the aftermath of battle, their faces peaceful in death, but their absence carving wounds in Harry's heart that would never fully heal. Neville Longbottom, who had transformed from frightened boy to fearless warrior under Harry's guidance, had died protecting younger students who reminded him of his own vulnerable past. Luna Lovegood, whose strange wisdom had brought comfort to so many during the darkest days, had fallen to a curse meant for Harry himself. Even some of his followers from the underground, people who had found purpose and belonging in his cause, now rested in the Great Hall surrounded by flowers that could never compensate for the futures they would never live. The wizarding world celebrated their savior with the kind of hysterical gratitude that transforms heroes into legends and legends into myths. But Harry felt no joy in their praise, only the hollow satisfaction of a job completed and a debt finally paid. The people who had cast him out now hailed him as their greatest champion, their desperate relief at survival temporarily overriding their memories of how they had treated him when he was merely dangerous, rather than desperately needed. Rita Skeeter's articles transformed his army of outcasts and criminals into noble freedom fighters. Her quick quotes quill rewriting history with the kind of creative interpretation that turned uncomfortable truths into palatable fiction. The same ministry officials who had voted for his expulsion now posed for photographs with the boy who had saved them, their smiles wide and their handshakes firm as they pretended that their fear and prejudice had been justified all along. But Harry knew the truth, that no amount of revisionist reporting could change. They celebrated him now only because he had proven useful, just as they had cast him out when he had proven dangerous. Their gratitude was conditional and temporary, lasting only as long as they needed someone to blame for the uncomfortable compromises that victory had required. The boy who lived had become the man who won. But winning had cost him everything he had once believed about the possibility of belonging somewhere. The trials that followed the war's end were swift and merciless, conducted with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that transformed complex moral questions into simple matters of legal procedure. Harry's testimony condemned dozens of former enemies and erstwhile allies alike, his words carrying the weight of absolute moral authority that came from being the one person no one dared question or contradict. The courtrooms of magical Britain became theatres where justice and vengeance performed elaborate dances, and Harry Potter served as both witness and judge. He spoke with clinical detachment about ministry officials who had imprisoned innocent Muggle-borns, about Board of Governors who had prioritised political convenience over student safety, about professors who had stood silent while injustice played out in their classrooms. His memory, sharpened by months of survival where forgetting details could mean death, provided evidence that sent dozens of formerly respectable citizens to Azkaban or exile, their comfortable lives destroyed by the consequences of choices they had thought would never be examined. But when the ministry offered him their highest honours, when grateful politicians tried to pin medals on his chest and name buildings after his achievements, Harry Potter declined them all with the same quiet firmness that had characterized every major decision of his war. The Order of Merlin meant nothing to someone who had learned that honor could not be bestowed by institutions that had proven themselves fundamentally corrupt. The gratitude of people who had abandoned him when he needed them most carried no weight with someone who had built his own family from society's discarded pieces. Even when Dumbledore extended a personal invitation to return to Hogwarts, to complete his education and perhaps one day teach there himself, Harry's rejection was gentle, but absolute. The old wizard's offer came with apologies that arrived years too late, and explanations that explained nothing important, wrapped in the kind of grandfatherly kindness that had once made Harry desperate for approval, but now felt like another form of manipulation. The truth that Harry had learned through months of exile and years of war was simpler and more devastating than any of them could understand. Belonging was not something that could be given or taken away by others, not a prize to be won through good behavior or a privilege to be earned through heroic deeds. It was something you created for yourself, built from the relationships that survived testing and the principles that remained constant, even when everything else fell apart. He had learned to find belonging in his own strength and in the loyalty of people who had chosen him when he had nothing to offer but shared struggle against impossible odds. That kind of belonging could not be legislated or awarded or apologized into existence. It could only be lived one choice at a time, one day at a time, one person at a time, in the place where his underground sanctuary had been, in tunnels that had sheltered his army during the darkest days of the war. Harry established something unprecedented in magical Britain's long and often shameful history: a school for the forgotten, the rejected, the overlooked, the deliberately ignored. It was not Hogwarts, with its houses and traditions and comfortable assumptions about who deserved magical education, but something entirely new, an institution built on the radical premise that magical potential existed wherever it chose to manifest, regardless of blood status or social acceptability. Here, in classrooms carved from London clay and lit by hybrid magical electrical systems that no traditional wizard could fully understand, squibs learned to channel magic through artifacts and alchemy, discovering that their lack of wand magic was not a disability, but a different kind of gift that opened doors others could never see. Half-breeds found acceptance not despite their mixed heritage, but because of the unique perspectives and abilities it provided, their differences celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Children like Harry had once been unwanted, abused, convinced they were freaks rather than miracles, discovered that their accidental magic was not something to be suppressed, but something to be nurtured, that the very intensity that made them dangerous also made them extraordinary. The school's curriculum included courses on magical theory that would have scandalized Hogwarts Board of Governors, taught by professors who had learned their craft in places where textbook answers could get you killed. The students who emerged from Harry's school were unlike anything the wizarding world had ever produced, competent in both magical and muggle technologies, comfortable with moral complexity, unimpressed by authority that had not earned their respect through competence rather than tradition. They went into the world carrying skills that traditional magical education could never provide, and perspectives that challenged every comfortable assumption about how their society should function. The establishment viewed Harry's school with the kind of nervous suspicion that institutions always reserved for alternatives that worked better than they did. But they could not argue with results. His graduates found jobs that had been closed to previous generations of outcasts, started businesses that bridged magical and muggle worlds, and slowly began to transform British magical society from within by proving that excellence could emerge from the most unlikely places. It was not Hogwarts, with its 1,000 years of tradition and its comfortable certainties about who belonged and who did not. Perhaps it was something better, a place where belonging was earned through loyalty rather than sorted by ancient hats, where potential was measured by achievement rather than ancestry, where the only tradition that mattered was the commitment to helping others discover what they were truly capable of becoming. Years later, as Harry walked through Hogsmeade on a crisp autumn evening that reminded him of his first trip to the magical village as a third-year student, who still believed that belonging somewhere was simply a matter of having the right paperwork, he caught sight of the castle rising against the star-filled sky like a monument to dreams he had once carried and subsequently outgrown. The familiar towers and battlements looked smaller than memory had preserved them, their magic diminished by distance and time rather than enhanced by nostalgia. The pain of his expulsion had long since faded into memory, transformed by years of building something better into his experience he could examine without flinching, like an old wound that had healed cleanly and left behind only the faintest scar. The boy who had been broken by rejection had grown into a man who understood that some gifts were too valuable to be bestowed by others, that the kind of belonging worth having could only be created through choices made freely, rather than sorting ceremonies attended under duress. He had become neither the hero Dumbledore had planned, nor the victim the Dursleys had intended, but something entirely his own creation, a teacher who had learned from his students, a leader who served those who followed him, a man who had found belonging, not in the approval of institutions, but in the loyalty of individuals who had chosen him when he had nothing to offer but shared struggle against impossible odds. As he turned away from the castle that had once been his world, walking back toward the life he had built from the ashes of his childhood dreams, Harry Potter smiled, not with the bitter satisfaction of revenge fulfilled, or the hollow triumph of vindication received too late, but with the quiet contentment that came from understanding a truth that had taken him years to learn. He didn't need their acceptance anymore, because he had finally learned to accept himself. The boy who had once desperately wanted to belong to their world had grown into a man who had created something better, and that transformation was worth more than all the house points and Quidditch victories and end-of-year feasts he had ever imagined winning. He had found his place not by fitting into spaces others had created, but by building spaces where people like him could finally belong.